Welcome, folks in the room, folks joining us on Zoom. Thank you so much for being here for this dual book talk on racial capital and climate migration with Neel Ahuja and Andrew Baldwin in conversation with Jemima Baada. So we are still waiting for Andrew to join us. So I'm very hopeful that he will be here shortly. But we are very grateful to have Neel and Jemima and all of you here for this conversation. I'm Sarah Nelson. I'm the research manager at the Center for Climate Justice. We're happy to host this event with our colleagues in the Center for Migration Studies. And we are so grateful to have these great scholars with us today. So I'll just do very brief intros for all of our speakers. And I'd like to first acknowledge that we're holding this event on the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam people. In the works we'll be discussing today, both Neel and Andrew take issue with how discourses of climate migration are used to reinforce forms of racial ordering and white supremacy that find themselves troubled or potentially troubled by climate change. So neither of these works deny that climate impacts around the world are among the multitude of factors that are shaping patterns of migration and human movement, but they instead call us to see and enact new forms of solidarity and mutual aid in response to these changes rather than participating in what Neel calls the politics of the armed lifeboat. So I think these works might also suggest how concerns over climate migration might obscure not only the role of colonial capitalism in driving migration, but also its ongoing investments in settler colonial violence. So I hope that this discussion today also calls us to consider how those of us who are settlers on and migrants to unceded lands simultaneously fulfill our obligations to the indigenous peoples who continue to steward these territories while also acting in solidarity with those who find themselves more recently displaced by the linked injustices of capitalism. So Neel Ahuja is joining us from the University of Maryland College Park, where he is professor in the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Neel's research explores the relationship of the body to the geopolitical, environmental, and public health contexts of colonial governance, warfare, and security. He's the author of 2 books, Bioinsecurities, Disease Interventions, Empire and the Government of Species, which was published in 2016 by Duke University Press, and Planetary Specters, Race, Migration, and Climate Change in the 21st Century, published in 2021 by University of North Carolina, which is the book we'll be talking with him about today, and which received honorable mention for the Association of Asian American Studies 2023 Multidisciplinary Interdisciplinary Book Award. So congratulations, Neel, for that. Apologies for those of you on Zoom. I keep looking behind me because that's where my screen is. So Neel's work is at the intersections of race and colonialism in the fields of disability studies and animal studies, and he's currently working on 2 research areas, one exploring the race and species politics of COVID-19 and another analyzing US counterterrorism, incarceration, rendition, and interrogation practices. Andrew Baldwin who'll be joining us shortly, is Associate Professor of Human Geography at Durham University and was previously the co-director of the Institute for Hazard, Risk, and Resilience at Durham. Andrew's writing examines the intersections of race, nature, and geography with a focus on how discourses and practices of climate change and migration relate to questions of humanism, post-humanism, politics, culture, urbanism, and the Anthropocene. He's the author of The Other of Climate Change, Racial Futurism, Migration, and Humanism, published by Rowman and Littlefield in 2022, which is the book we'll be discussing today, and also the co-editor of Life Adrift, Climate Change, Migration, Critique in 2017, and Climate Change, Migration, and Human Rights, Law and Policy Perspectives, also in 2017. Jemima Baada is the Assistant Professor of Geography here at UBC, and she's an interdisciplinary climate migration scholar who works at the intersections of gender, climate change, migration, health, and development equity. Her work's been published in the Journal of Agrarian Change, the Journal of Healthcare for the Poor and Underserved, and the Sociology of Health and Illness, among other venues. She has also worked with multiple NGOs on issues related to migration and resilient livelihoods. So welcome, everyone. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Jemima to open our discussion. And pardon me for a second while I just change my screen. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much for Thank you so much for those introductions, Sarah. Thank you all so much for making the time to be here today. And it's a great pleasure to have you join us, Andrew and Neil. And I feel very privileged to be having this discussion with you about your respective books. As one whose own research looks at the ways in which climate change related effects such as poor rainfall, poor soil fertility influence agrarian groups' decisions to migrate for agricultural purposes, I was very intrigued by how you both situated the concept of climate migration within racial capitalism. And I definitely learned so much from your works, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more from you both about your motivations for undertaking these projects. And we also have some discussion questions to facilitate our discussions. I'm not sure if to proceed or if to give it a bit to see if Andrew joins us soon.
Yeah, it would be wonderful to be in conversation with Andrew. I hope we can get him into the Zoom soon too. Whatever you all think makes most sense.
Sorry, folks. I think it would be great to just begin the conversation, and we'll see if we can be reaching out. And I hope that there wasn't just a time zone confusion, because we were working across multiple time zones here. So I know that, you know, we were very recently in conversation. So I think perhaps we can begin the discussion.
Okay, that was a little faint on my end, but I think, Sarah, you said we can start, right? And then okay, all right. Okay, well, so maybe we could start with, your motivations for undertaking these research projects. So maybe Andrew, I can start with you. And in your book, you really hook readers in when you state on page 4 that, and I'm quoting directly here, discourses of climate migration highlight purported migration hotspots as sites of environmental degradation. Displaced groups and environments are in turn drawn into old-fashioned racial stereotyping about how the world's poor mismanage resources and engage in resource conflicts, a phenomenon that increasingly overlaps with newer forms of speculative prediction about how vulnerable groups will face coming climate destruction. Working against these twin forms of racial representation of climate change, Planetary Spectres offers an alternative method for making sense of the connections among neoliberal policies, race, and environmental destruction in contemporary migration flows. Neel, can you tell us more about your motivation for undertaking this very important project of troubling these narratives of climate migration and climate migrants?
Sure. Thank you so much for the question. And I want to thank all of the organizers for your work in getting the event together today. I was interested in writing about climate migration, but I got to the point a little bit obliquely. I think when I was starting this project, I was initially focused on certain questions about essentially how this kind of massive moment of species extinction that we're witnessing right now is something that was escaping representation in various modes of academic inquiry and kind of political forums on climate change. So one aspect of just the starting set of questions was that I was engaged, and I've written a series of essays in a field called animal studies. And that is a field where you would expect that mass species extinction would be on the agenda. And yet it's not at all within that field. And so why? Why is it that a certain kind of figuration of an animal at risk of slaughter or an animal subjected to certain forms of individuated displacement or violence can enter into the kinds of sentimental colonial representation that brings about political narratives of rescue or intervention, etc., but not the kind of mass violences of climate change. As I started reading and thinking about what it would mean to give a different kind of political account of extinctions, one of the things that just became apparent to me and really changed the direction of the book and the research was, oh, hi, Andrew. I'm just talking about my book and how I got to it real quick. Was, just noticing that there was a sudden shift as I was working on this project that highly emphasized climate change as a matter of state security. And, that wasn't what I was looking at initially. I was trying to think about maybe more of a kind of political theorizing kind of thing, about question about like what is representation, what is representable in terms of species extinction, these mass biodiversity losses. And what was happening, I guess, to some extent with the collapse of certain types of international agreements, was that climate change was being routed into a national security framework. And as someone who had written about security before, I was picking up, as I read the set of kind of public proclamations about the necessity of defense, thinking about climate change. One of the things that came up front was the mobilization of a certain kind of racial discourse within it that wasn't simply about the tragic victims of climate change, but was actually about the adaptation strategies of people displaced, the ways in which indigenous knowledges of climate change could not just be used for indigenous, lifeways and strategies of resurgence, but also could be abstracted for everybody's use. And so the mobilization of the climate refugee as a security body was kind of like, it was a shift in where this project went for me. And it required thinking about what I think both of our books, and so it was kind of nice to look back at yours before this event, Andrew. Both of them settle on the idea that the climate refugee is a figure, and that the figure of the climate refugee is doing certain kinds of ideological work in an international scenario where a lot of emphasis on reducing carbon emissions, reducing the basic destructive forms of extraction that the current moment in capitalism causes, focus on that has dissipated, and there's more focus on adaptation. Well, who is adapting in this scenario? And it is certain racialized populations whose knowledge is ripe for extraction. So that was like the aha moment for, how am I gonna think about climate change as a political question in this moment? I still wanted to think about the species difference question, but it comes in a little bit more through the reading of the fossil fuel economy as an economy that has always extracted certain types of human labor and certain types of dead bodies of many species. So these were starting points. And as I delved more into climate security and climate migration discourses, I ended up focusing on what I see as a kind of critique of the Anthropocene debate, which is to say, I'm interested in thinking about scale and about what thinking transregionally, as opposed to thinking in gigantic swaths of time and space in Anthropocene discourses are doing, because then you can see some of these dynamics that are masked by the figure of the climate refugee, particularly extractive forms of carbon-based capitalism that produce certain migration patterns. Those kinds of questions were where I ended up going in the book, and ended up focusing on the figure of the climate refugee, a racial critique of the climate refugee as a security figure, and then thinking in particular about the ways that disability, race, gender, and adaptation fit together in that media discourse. I hope that gives a kind of little bit of an outline.
It does. Thank you so much, Neel. Andrew, glad to have you here. So before we get into our discussion questions, we just wanted to have an idea of what motivated you to undertake your respective projects. And so a quote, an opening statement that gripped me in your book, Andrew, was when you said in your preface that, and I'm quoting directly, "This is a book about climate change and race." To be clear, though, it is not a book that examines how the impacts of climate change are disproportionately experienced by the Black and Brown majority of the world. Rather, it is one about the racialization of a specific political relation, that between climate change and migration. And then you go on to say, the discourse on climate change and migration is, in this sense, a form of power that reproduces a racialized social hierarchy between white humanism and what we might call the racial other of climate change, the figure purportedly displaced by climate. Andrew, could you tell us more about how you arrived at this position?
Okay, first of all, hi. Thank you, Jemima, for the question. And to everyone, my profuse apologies for coming in late. I honestly thought that this was happening at 7 o'clock UK time, not 6. So anyway, I apologize for that. And thank you as well to the Center for Climate Justice and Center for Migration at UBC for hosting this event and putting Neel and I into dialogue around our books. This is a really fun thing for me anyway to be doing. So thank you for that. Right. I suppose, I mean, before answering the question, I thought maybe what I would do is just say something about, for me, what motivated the writing of it. And really, it's a long-standing concern of mine for 20 years, longer, even since I was an undergraduate student back in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The way that whiteness became sort of bedfellows with environment. And I don't think there's anything particularly novel about that insight. It was just something that really has always really struck me, the way that, whiteness comes to re-articulate its power through, amongst other things, environmental politics, and climate change is one of those, discourses where that happens. And it's a sacred cow, right? You can't level this type of critique at climate change without inviting scorn, because climate change has such universal significance, right? Anyway, so it sort of that concern for me is partly what motivated me into thinking about race and climate change. And I thought, well, maybe I could unpack this if I start looking at questions about the relationship between climate change and human migration. So I very tepidly started to venture into, the field, as it were, back in the sort of around 2010, 2009, 2010 period. And very quickly got this sense that, the figure of the climate migrant stroke refugee was a really problematic figure, that it was really, poorly defined or undefinable. And it really felt like it was, a kind of racial category. And I think I just, without really being able to say precisely how, and I think over the last sort of, 10 years or so, I've been really trying to think about the way in which this category and this sort of phenomena and discourse, climate change and migration, encompass, a whole host of different types of racial meaning. Yeah, so that's, I suppose, just the background motivation. So you're going to have to tell me the question again. There was a lengthy quote in the preface that you read.
Yes, I guess the quote was just to get you talking about your motivation, because I think that was right after that quote, then you stated in the book that this is how you arrived at this position, and
Right.
yeah, the motivation to undertake this project. So I think you've
Right.
answered the question already. Thank you so much,
Okay.
Andrew. Yeah. Okay. Well, then we'll get into our discussion questions. And so our first question is, in your books, you both take up the concept of, racial capitalism. And I'm interested in understanding how you both conceptualize race in your work. And also, what does the current rhetoric around climate change and migration allow us to say about the category of race? And maybe we can start with Neel.
Sure. Thanks for this question. And I really like how the two books have some overlap and have some differences on this question. So I've already mentioned that I was interested in racial securitization as part of what is going on in climate change. So when I talk about that in chapter 1 of the book, one of the ways that I kind of set it up is to think about environmental justice movements and the way that they have conceptualized race and racism. And one of the things that I'm interested in is the idea of unequal vulnerability. So sometimes one of the ways that it's substantiated that there's an environmental racism existing in a particular context, such as factory pollution or landfill siting. These are kind of now commonplace ways that it's documented in the US social science literature, is to actually provide data that demonstrates unequal vulnerability. So that means that there is a certain kind of data form to the kind of evidence that's provided for thinking racially. And part of what I came to think about and question is, in a scenario where, in terms of the law, in terms of how institutions like environmental protection agencies of different governments might approach the question, if it's a post facto determination that is the site at which knowledge about racism, environmental racism, comes to the fore, what does that mean for trying to oppose environmental racism? Are we only going to know about what environmental racism is after the unequal vulnerability is evident in people's bodies and in people's unfortunate deaths? Or is there some way that we can reconceptualize the temporality of racialization that might help us kind of actually attack that systematic or structural forms of unequal vulnerability? So one of the ways that I kind of pursue that in the book is to work with theories of racial capitalism. So of course, I'm indebted to Cedric Robinson on that point, but also to many other people who've written about racial capitalism. The list is too long to go into here, but one of the things that I wanted to do is to think about how in the classic accounts of racial capitalism, particularly from Robinson, there is a kind of broad cartography of labor and how race and labor can join in the expansion of systems of capitalism, and then also in certain forms of resistance to it. And one thing that I became interested in is how the forms of quote unquote primary accumulation that are within that account are then related to other forms of accumulation, extraction, land use that's related to fossil fuels. What would the difference be if we were to think of environmental justice and environmental racism, not only in terms of post facto determinations of unequal vulnerability, but about the structures that generate that? And so that meant not only looking at carbon as waste that kind of pollutes and destroys people's environments and health, but thinking of carbon as a productive engine of global capitalism. So thinking about the labor side, thinking about the extraction side, and thinking about the waste side, a triple pointed account of environmental racism might help us do the work of attacking the system, in addition to accounting for the unequal vulnerability to premature death, if we want to use Ruth Wilson Gilmore's famous phrase. So if I had to, in a nutshell, explain how I'm approaching race in this book, that's how I'm doing it. It's not an account of race that presumes that there are certain racial categories in advance. The work of racialization is occurring within these different modalities of capitalist, like extraction, primitive accumulation, labor, and then of course the waste economies of capital too.
Thank you so much, Neel. That is very enlightening. Over to you, Andrew. I'll repeat the question. So how do you conceptualize race in your work? And what does the current rhetoric around climate change and migration allow us to say about the category of race?
Right. I'm approaching race, I think, quite differently than Neel. The book opens with a reference to Deepak Chakrabarty, where Chakrabarty makes the argument that, climate change and the Anthropocene are fundamentally destabilizing phenomena, in the sense that for him, it's really difficult to discern a kind of what it means to be human in a context in which the sort of, the distinction between nature and society, which, is the sort of founding distinction that draws humanism sort of into existence, if you like, becomes blurred. And, in a context in which humans are, geological agents on par with any other Earth force, this sort of planetary context that we're in at the moment is a fundamentally destabilizing one. We lose a sense of what it means to be human. And this is what I take Deepak Chakrabarty to be saying. And I think others make the same claim. I think Bruno Latour makes similar arguments as well. And I think partly what I'm trying to do in the book is suggest that the figure of the climate migrant is a sort of category of race, if you like, that resolves or ameliorates this crisis of humanism. I mean, this is what I take race to do fundamentally, is that the human is sort of relentlessly, encountering the possibilities for its own dissolution. It's being continuously reminded of its own historicity, even while humanism and white humanism are really sort of, wedded to, a kind of ahistorical account of their racial identities. So I'm just saying that humanism is continuously sort of encountering the possibility for its own dissolution, and race is the category that ameliorates that crisis. And I think that something similar is at stake in this discussion about in the context of climate change, where this is a really profoundly destabilizing phenomena that, portends the end of humans tout court, right? Like, Extinction Rebellion captures that really succinctly in the name of the movement. And the argument that I'm making is that the figure of the climate migrant refugee is a category of race that is invented precisely in order to restabilize and recenter the human at the very planetary moment in which the human is sort of staring down the possibility of its own extinction. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about race, that, race is, perennially the thing that resolves the crisis of meaning that sort of defines humanism, if you like. I think more specifically, race is, typically, and I'm getting this from Stuart Hall and Kalpana Seshadri Crooks, who I really like a lot. This idea that, race is forever, the notion of race is a sliding signifier, the notion that race is forever being anchored in its meaning by metaphors of nature. Biology and anthropological difference are the two sort of, very common ways that race is anchored to questions of nature. But I think what I'm doing later in the book is suggesting that environmental risk does something similar. When we conceptualize environmental risk solely in terms of, in the context of climate change, a set of pending geophysical effects that are shorn of their historical substance, then, you start to enter into this, space where, race is being anchored to this, naturalizing metaphor, in this case, environmental risk. So that's kind of, I think, how I'm thinking about race in the book. In terms of the question about, rhetoric, and what does the rhetoric allow us to say about the category? I think that kind of depends on whose rhetoric, really, because the climate change and migration discourse is really quite multifaceted. It's not reducible to questions about security, and it's not reducible to questions about humanitarianism and victimhood and so forth. It's quite multifaceted, and so whose rhetoric are we talking about? I think one thing that I noticed, and I have to be sort of clear about this, is that in the book I'm really dealing primarily with international discourses around climate change and migration. So the kinds of discourses that you would find in international agencies and the sort of reports and texts that they produce and so forth. So this is really quite specific, but there is a kind of a strong, what presents itself as a very progressive narrative around climate change and migration, specifically around this question of causality and determinism. So, the discourse is relentlessly informing us that, we're not talking about climatic determinism here. We're not talking about the fact that climate, or the possibility that climate, determines migration or is a causal driver of migration. The argument is always framed in more progressive terms, which is to say that, the argument is made that climate change is, the relationship between climate change and migration is far more complex and involves, is multi-causal, involves a whole range of different historical, political, economic forces that converge to affect people's mobility. But what is interesting is that I went and read Ellsworth Huntington, and he makes basically that exact argument, right? Like, he's basically making the argument that, climate change is mediated by a whole host of sort of intermediating factors, and it's, changes to those agricultural conditions, for example, that are drivers of migration. And that's precisely what the so-called progressive international discourse on climate change and migration is doing. So anyway, what does the rhetoric allow us to say about race? I think it allows us to say that race is alive and well in the discourse and is just, being reproduced, I guess.
Could I just ask you like a follow-up about that? I'm really taken with and interested in how you talk about racial futurism. And I think that each of us have like a way of thinking about time and race together in our books. And so I was wondering if the kind of future-oriented aspect of these racializing figures, like how you're thinking about that. Is this like race as emergent, like something to come, or is the future-orientedness of it actually reflecting something about present or past? If you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. Racial. I'm still trying to work out what I mean by racial futurism. I think what I'm trying to suggest is that, whereas, for example, in the 19th century, race tended to operate with a kind of historical orientation, a past-oriented orientation, where, the racial other in relation to, a progressive modernity was ordinarily cast in primordial terms, in prehistoric terms, as existing outside the sort of framework of ordinary historical modernity, but at the beginning of time, if you like. And there's something interesting, I think, about the advent of the Anthropocene and the climate crisis in general, is that it really reorients the human imaginary away from its historical substance and more towards its longevity, its future. And I think partly racial futurism is about trying to chart the way that the racial other is configured less in primordial terms and more in sort of futuristic, yet to come terms. It's not so much a reflection. It's not so much a sort of a reflection on what the structure of catastrophe narratives can tell us about us in the present. So much as what I'm trying to get at with racial futurism is that it is a kind of orientation that invites us to forget history, right? I think I don't know if that clarifies, but that's kind of how I'm thinking about racial futurism. It's a sense, there's a sense that, yeah, it's sort of racial futurism I'm thinking of as a kind of political technology of sense making, right? It generates a particular sense or orientation to the way that we think about the future.
Neel, does that respond to your? Okay, all right. Thank you so much. Andrew, I would like to build on some of the ideas that you just raised, in relation to Stuart Hall, social relations and racial futurism. But I'll give you a breather and I will pose my next question to Neel. So Neel, you take up ideologies of disabilities in your work. And so I'm wondering how racialized ideologies of disability reinforce or define or redefine the categorization of the climate migrant.
Yeah, thanks for focusing on this. And this is a central topic that I address in one of the chapters. I'm interested in how, as both collectivities and as individuated bodies, public depictions of climate migrants, climate refugees signal a kind of set of both compromised abilities and perhaps in some cases superhuman abilities of people who are on the move. And so, there's one chapter where I talk about the kind of representational move from insecurity to adaptation, where there's representations of climate refugees either in locations of flooding, desertification, warfare, where people are fleeing, people may be maimed or injured as part of the migration process. And those are part of the tragic kind of side or the violent side of climate refugee discourses, which kind of follow on a very well-known, well-trodden set of colonial rescue discourses, right? This is one of the contexts we're dealing with, and how international media representations as well as international institutions view mass displacement in the global south as a kind of coming plague. This can be done in a kind of more liberal bent, which is to say, like, let's rethink the international compact on migration and let more people into the rich countries, or it can be done in a right-wing way to say, we've got to address climate change so these people don't come to quote unquote our borders or our doorstep or whatever. Then there are a series of images of climate adaptation, and this dovetails to some extent with the IPCC and UN kind of discourses on adaptation, where it is that very experience of vulnerability that gives special knowledge. And so I analyze in the book a series of images that reflect this move from insecurity to adaptation. I'm looking in particular at National Geographic, which is, again, a kind of well-trodden source of a certain form of humanitarian representation. But the images are interesting in part because they really stress resilience, population level skills, and adaptation strategies. And they reflect this future orientation in the figure of the climate refugee that, on the one hand, can be a source of instability in the international system, but on the other hand, could be a resource to be extracted from its current local location. One of the things that I argue in the Bangladesh chapter that focuses on this, drawing on a history of work in South Asian studies that is dealing with it, is to think about what is absented by turning to that future adaptation, what relations, economic relations, are happening on the ground now, where the vision of adaptation is being used to absent certain populations from economic opportunities, or even from simple infrastructural remediation of negative effects of flooding, for example. So I think in that sense, the kind of future orientation, securitizing climate change through the racialized bodies of people who are on the move, is something that is one of the really insidious kind of elements of climate change discourse that can be used against people who are really facing imminent forms of devastation. And so this is one of the problems that requires further thinking and reflection. And I can say more about that, but maybe we should stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Neel. That's very insightful. And the chapter on Bangladesh was also really insightful for me, because I had never really thought about, how some of those class relations play out at the national level. And, just reading that chapter and thinking about, current discussions in Ghana around climate change, I realized that, yes, it is a discourse that can still be used in some sense to reinforce existing, social class relations in ways that continue to marginalize the people that are already marginalized in these relations, discourses, conversations. Yeah.
Can I just add one more note? One of the kind of things I want us to pay attention to is how the destruction of somebody's life world, household, local ecology, however you want to talk about it, is romanticized in ways that make me pause, because it's not like people have been living outside of this kind of devastation. It's not like it's a new thing. And the kinds of accounts that are being used to say that adaptation reflects kind of, this optimistic future, that people are overcoming their kind of disabilities in these moments of environmental destruction, the scenarios are, you can make comparisons to places that are just affected by standard variety warfare or forms of ethnic cleansing, where, why is it that a group of coastal people in Bangladesh get pictured as the future of climate adaptation because they learn how to, rebuild structures after they've been flooded or move them down the river, when, populations, for example, like Bedouin communities in the Negev in Israel, are like their villages are razed like 90 times, and they have to rebuild them over and over again, and they're not being held up as the international model of like development and climate adaptation. So there's something about the faked newness of this that needs pause and consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's definitely that infantilization. And yes, I love how you trouble all of those ideas in your book. Okay, now on to you, Andrew. So in your book, you quote Stuart Hall, who says, and I quote, "Racisms also dehistoricize, translating historically specific structures into the timeless language of nature," unquote. So I'm wondering, how does the racialized category of the climate migrant or refugee naturalize social relations under capitalism?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think this is the dehistoricization is the work that is accomplished by the figure of the climate migrant refugee. I think it's a fundamentally dehistoricizing category. So just to give examples then of how the figure of the climate migrant refugee naturalizes social relations in their capitalism, and just pick up on Neel's insights about Bangladesh, which often gets held up as ground zero of climate migration. The idea is that increased cyclonic activity in the Bay of Bengal, increasing levels of salination in arable land along that coastline is, driving, something like half a million people into Dhaka and Chittagong on an annual basis, or something like that, or even more, with even more greater frequency. I can't remember exactly what it is, but the sort of unofficial number that people will often throw about is something around 500,000 people moving to both of those cities. So when you go to Bangladesh, I mean, it's a universe. You speak to English-speaking Bangladeshis, and it's a really common claim that people are moving because of climate change, and this is a real problem, and so on. But then, if you look at the history of that coastline, the World Bank has been encouraging the Bangladeshi state to invest in aquaculture, shrimp farming, soft shell crab farming, so various forms of extraction, for the last 40 years. And those investments have radically reorganized land tenure in coastal Bangladesh in a way that has a powerful displacement effect on people. They end up being pushed off of their land. They end up being forced into wage labor, really precarious labor. And then, invariably people end up moving to Dhaka as a means of supplementing farm gate incomes. So, I would argue that, in the context of Bangladesh, it's the long history of capital investment along that coastline that, is the primary reason why so many people are moving into Dhaka and Chittagong, not climate change. In fact, if anything, climate change has a kind of temporary displacement effect, and then people just go back to their homes again. That is to say, after some sort of a cyclonic event. But when the language of climate migration is used to characterize that rural to urban migration dynamic in a place like Bangladesh, it naturalizes, social relations. Or the inverse of that is that it dehistoricizes that whole coastline in Bangladesh. So that's an example. Another example that I think is really illustrates the same thing is Ile de Jean Charles in coastal Louisiana. Neel, I can't remember if you talk about Ile de Jean Charles in your book. You do, I think.
Just very briefly in the introduction. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's such an interesting case. So the island is inhabited by Native Americans who were, historically had been forced to move from Florida through the Trail of Tears migration in the early 19th century, and they ended up settling in Ile de Jean Charles and coastal Louisiana. And they applied, they're right out in the Gulf of Mexico, and so heavily exposed to cyclonic activity and so on. So they applied to the U.S. federal government for funding and ended up winning something like $50 million to relocate themselves from the current island to somewhere inland. And the media, said, "Oh, climate refugees. This is America's first climate refugees in Ile de Jean Charles." But then, there's a much more complicated story at stake here insofar as Ile de Jean Charles is also located in the very epicenter of the oil and gas sector in coastal Louisiana. There are a lot active oil wells all around that whole area. Pipelines bisect the island. They pass, over the island and through it and so on. These pipelines are continuously having to be dredged. That in combination with the channeling of the Mississippi River and all of the sedimentation that would ordinarily, backflow into that whole bayou ecosystem now gets pushed further out into the Gulf of Mexico. And those two things in combination, the channeling of the Mississippi and oil and gas investment and oil and gas infrastructure along that whole coastline are, the primary reasons why that the bayou is disappearing, why it's receding, and why, communities are so exposed to increased hurricane activity. So the idea that they're climate refugees, it kind of, it just erases all of that history and, invites us to forget that, it's capital investment in these places that is the principal driver behind people's vulnerabilities, not climate change. So that's what I'm trying to get at in this idea that using Stuart Hall's idea that racism's dehistoricized by pushing social relations into the naturalizing social relations.
Absolutely. And again, this is very relatable for me because the study area that I do my research, which is also where I come from in Ghana, the northern part of Ghana, it was historically left under developed. So no, infrastructure was put up in that part of the country because the British colonists weren't interested in whatever was happening in that part of the country. So they set up infrastructure in the southern sector. They built, roads, railways. They set up plantations, and they would bring people from the northern sector as forced labor to work in these plantations. After colonization, after formal colonization, we saw subsequent Ghanaian governments continue these uneven development patterns as a way of sustaining the industries that by this time were established in the South, right? And so now it is true that the northern part of the country is undergoing, severe climate change effects by way of deteriorating rainfall and fossil fertility. But at the same time, if people had options outside of farming livelihoods, the impact wouldn't be as serious as they are. And so just thinking about or just saying that people are moving because of climate change is really taking away all of that history about why people don't have options outside of farming livelihoods in that area to begin with. So yeah, thank you both so much, Neel and Andrew, for those insightful discussions. So we've already touched on this a little bit, to some extent in our discussions, but I was wondering if you could both say more about, theories of racial capitalism. So you both engage with theories of racial capitalism in detail in your books. And so I'm wondering what they offer us in thinking about climate change and migration.
Do you want to go first? Should I go first? Either.
Okay. Yeah, I can. I mean, I guess, what do theories of racial capitalism offer thinking about climate migration? I guess the first thing is theories of racial capitalism remind us that capitalism is inevitably, invariably, embedded with race and vice versa. So theories of racial capitalism, I think, demand that we ask how race and racism come to be reproduced in discourses around climate change. And I think in particular, climate change is no longer a kind of, an environmental problem that is, that no one cares about, but is, absolutely at the very core of the contemporary transformation of capitalism, right? Capitalism is now having to confront, its historical implication in climate change, and is doing, whatever it can to try and find a pathway out. Now, so there's a kind of innocence that attaches to capital under those conditions, right? When you hear Mark Carney, former director of the Bank of Canada and director of the Bank of England, he presents a really compelling argument about the, capitalism's extraordinary capacity to adapt to changing circumstances. And there's an innocent quality to it, right? It's kind of an admittance. We got it wrong for the last 100 years or whatever. Now we're prepared to do things correctly. So I think, racial capitalism invites us to sort of really interrogate the way that race is not just a peripheral or accidental feature of the sort of transformation of capitalism in relation to climate change, but it lies at the very core of it. So, what does that actually look like is, I think, a really important question. The thinking that I've been doing on this is, I think, still, pretty rudimentary, but I'm trying to, in the later chapter of the book, trying to think about, the relationship between what Neel was talking about earlier about, migration as a sort of technique for adapting to climate change. The sort of positive, account of migration rather than one that constructs migration in terms of failure or security risk or victimhood. It's sort of the migration as adaptation discourse really centers the agency of the migrant in a way that aligns really nicely with a sort of progressive liberalism. So I've been trying to think about, racial capitalism in relation to that. And the sort of provisional conclusion that I set out in the book is that, within this discourse, the figure of the migrant, the figure of the climate migrant becomes a use value for capital. So, if we can construct those who are most at risk of climate change and those who are most at risk of having to move because of climate change as, self-possessed and agents of their own lives who can migrate in order to adapt to these unfortunate circumstances, then this should be welcomed. But the sort of international, the examples that are often used of, forms of adaptive migration are things like, Bangladeshis, entering into temporary circular migration schemes where they end up in the Gulf working in, building football stadiums or doing domestic labor. And, this is extremely precarious labor, right? And, the fantasy of the adaptation discourse is that when migrants access the global remittance economy, those remittances then get sent back home, and those remittances can be used to foster adaptation, and so on and so on. Anyway, I think so. Partly what I'm trying to suggest is that the sort of the risk of those who are at risk of migration become a use value for capital, and similarly with the an example in around insurance, the idea that those who are at risk of migration can enter into sort of micro insurance schemes, or that will give them a certain amount of liquidity in if a certain set of environmental conditions are met through the technique of parametric insurance. It sounds all very progressive and wonderful, but it's basically translating the everyday risks that people face, translating, if you like, the threat of what I'm calling in the book, the threat of blackness, translating that into a use value for capital. So risks become monetized in the forms of insurance, and then those insurance contracts circulate within wider, financial circuits and so on. I mean, that's how I'm thinking about racial capitalism.
Thank you so much, Andrew. What about you, Neel?
I'll try to be brief. So chapter 2 of the book kind of engages with the literature on racial capitalism. It gives, it actually kind of takes a position on some of the histories involved and says one way we can give an account of this is to look at how the kind of current neoliberal configuration that has moved towards expanding Asian manufacturing, including in places like Bangladesh, relies on a certain kind of oil economy in which, you know, Persian Gulf countries are very central. And I try to kind of think about, okay, if what we want to do is think racial capitalism in this moment where new kind of trans-regional migrations have taken shape. I'm thinking particularly about the South Asia to Gulf migration corridor. How does that relate to the kind of structural form of the oil economy? How does that relate to questions like logistics and making a kind of transnational shipping economy possible? And how does that relate to state formations in the global South, which are in some cases promoting out migration? So, you know, if the South Asia to Persian Gulf corridor is one of the sites in which you would expect to see a lot of quote unquote climate migration, what would happen if we gave an account of racial capitalism from a kind of trans-regional perspective? I don't want to do the Anthropocene level account, and I don't want to do a super localized account. I want to think about what's going on in the trans-regional scale in order to kind of understand how these big processes are conducting migration and interacting with things like environmental devastation. And so I look at that migration pattern in particular for that set of reasons, trying to both disrupt the Anthropocene scale of the human and then to think about the complexity of racial capitalism in a moment when financialization, transnational logistics, complicated state remittance economies, et cetera, are influencing these trans-regional connections. So the kind of place that I settle on is that in order to understand racial capitalism or to understand climate change, you first have to put the productive forces of capitalism and the structure of the international economy back into the equation. It's not enough to do an accounting of carbon generated waste. We have to understand how extraction, financialization, et cetera, work. And then second, the kind of more speculative, future-oriented part of this is we have to think about natural capital and what's going on with the revaluation of quote-unquote nature as a new type of resource for neoliberal rationalities of the economy. And so, you know, if you look at the Gulf oil-producing countries, like the way that their oil resources are valued by the World Bank right now, it expresses a certain deep inequality compared to a country like Bangladesh, who now, because, you know, ecotourism and other natural capital, you know, elements of the economy can be valued in a new way. Bangladesh no longer ends up looking like it's lowest on the scale of wealth as it used to. Or at least as low as it used to be viewed. And so that means that to some extent, the Bangladeshi state is forced to perform this kind of climate migration discourse in order to seek certain kinds of remittances in the international economy, as well as certain kinds of out-migration that it might want to push. So the point of this all is to say that racial capitalism and environmental destruction go hand in hand. And I'm not saying that environmental destruction doesn't encourage migration, it does. However, not putting it into conversation with the ways that extraction and planned forms of labor migration flows are generating certain types of migration configurations means that we lose the actual kind of lived battles that we might want to fight. So the trans-regional scale is kind of the most important takeaway for me. Like the racial capitalism analysis for me, I want it to happen there because I feel like politically that's going to be the most advantageous to challenging some of these dynamics.
Okay, thank you so much, Neel and Andrew. So I think we are at time. for the Q&A. So thank you so much once again for, these really in-depth and insightful discussions about your books. We'll open up the floor for questions from the audience.